All right, and we're live. So, for the audience that does not know you, please feel free to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Bobby Chacon, and I was a 27-year FBI agent.
So, we spoke a little bit about this before the show started, like just before the show started. Um, so what were your main roles as an FBI agent? Because you never, as you just told me, you never went beyond a field agent. You were never in a position of management or anything higher than that. You were never, special agent in charge. You just led teams, and you were in leadership position, but it was more in the sense of teams as a field
Yeah,
agent.
sure.
So
I
yeah.
was a 27-year field agent. I left Quantico, my training, we all go through the same training. I left Quantico and I told my counsel, I never want to be in management. I didn't want to wear a suit and a tie and sit behind a desk. I always wanted to be in the field. I wanted to lock up bad guys, put them in jail. That's what my dad did as a cop in New York City. That's what my brother did as a cop in New York City. I grew up on Long Island. I went to law school first, then I went into the FBI, so I was a lawyer. And I just wanted to be in the field. I wanted to do the down and dirty work of the FBI. And I never was interested in sitting behind a desk, pushing paper around. That's management stuff. And so 27 years later, I retired as a field agent. Now in the FBI has a very flat management structure. So if you look at the field office, say the Newark field office, right? The Newark field office, if you're a street agent, there's only three positions between you and the whole top guy in the Newark field office. There's an agent, then there's a supervisory special agent who has a squad of agents, maybe 10 to 12 agents. Maybe they work bank robberies, maybe they work, whatever. And then, so you have a supervisor of that squad. And then above that supervisor, you have assistant special agent in charge, or we call an ASAC. And he might have 5 or 10 squads. So he has 5 or 10 supervisory special agents, and then maybe 100 agents under him, kind of. And then above that, you have the special agent in charge, and he's in charge of the entire division. And he might have 4 or 5 ASACs, or assistant special agent in charge, below each of them, 10 or 12 supervisors, and then below. So it's very flat, unlike, most police departments that have like all these different, paramilitary kind of command structures. The FBI is more flat. Now there's 3 exceptions to that: Washington field office, New York field office, and the Los Angeles field office. Those are so big, they have 3 or 4 or 5 special agents in charge, and then they have an assistant director in charge of that field office. Those 3 field offices are the biggest in the FBI, so they have a little different management structure. But normally, say, Philadelphia, Newark, Baltimore, they only have 1 special agent in charge, and then that structure that I just described. So in my role as a street agent, I did many, many different things. I started off working the Mafia in New York City, the Lucchese family. So the New York field office has 1 squad dedicated to each of the 5 families, right? The Gambinos, the Lucchese's, the Genovese, the Colombos. So my squad was out in the Queens office in Queens, New York, not the main office in Manhattan. And we looked at the Lucchese organized crime family. That's the family made famous by the movie Goodfellas. So Henry Hill, played by Ray Liotta in Goodfellas, was an informant on my squad when I was there. The squad next to us was the Gambino squad, which was the John Gotti squad. John Gotti led the Gambino crime family. So we sat right next. So I did, I started off doing traditional mafia work, right? The things you see on the TV, wiretap, sitting in a small little closet, or sitting in a surveillance van with blacked out windows, watching these guys, or developing informants and talking to them in the street. From there, I transitioned into gangs, drug gangs, mainly Jamaicans, the dreadlock guys, along what we call posses in New York and Brooklyn, mainly in the Bronx, and did that for a number of years. And then I became a diver, a part-time diver on the New York office dive team, which was at that point the only real sanctioned dive team in the FBI. There were other offices that might have had like a more of a ad hoc dive component, but the FBI only recognized the New York team at the time. And then I transitioned. I was in the right place at the right time. And in the late 1990s, I transitioned, and the FBI laboratory took over the dive program of New York and said, we want to replicate what you've done in New York because it's so popular now, and we need it in other parts of the bureau, because DNA had come along in the 80s, and crime scenes in the 80s and 90s became real popular. Every FBI field office, there are 56 of them in the United States, and about 90 overseas offices now. But every one of the 56 field offices had a crime scene team, specialized. We call them ERTs. We don't call them CSIs, right? We call them ERT, evidence response teams. And we decided through the lab that we were going to make 4 dive teams under that program. We call them USERT, or Underwater Search and Evidence Response Teams. They're in the same program. They're funded by the lab, the Forensic Science Unit. And the only reason we did 4, and you can't have one in every field office like the 56, because there's not enough work for the divers. You're not in the water every day, and so those skills are perishable. So we kept those 4 teams busy by traveling to all the other field divisions, and so they were busy enough where their skills wouldn't get rusty and stuff, because they were being used a lot. So then I spent a number of years leading the New York office dive team. I was there on 9/11. My brother was a police officer in New York City there on that day as well. And then in 2003, I transferred to the Los Angeles field office, and I ran what we call the special events program, which means I was the FBI liaison to things like the Grammys, the Oscars, all the Rose Bowl, the Rose Bowl parade, all the big special events. Every field office also has an agent that's in charge of those things. New York, and as you can imagine, New York, Washington with the inauguration type stuff, and Los Angeles with all the entertainment stuff. That's a pretty busy job. And I had that while I was also a part-time diver for the Los Angeles team. And then ultimately I took over the dive team in Los Angeles, and ran that for a number of years, and retired in 2014.
Well, now you are doing writing, basically, right? It's a very big jump, but at the same time, it's one that a lot of people could imagine. You now write, and you write mainly on not true crime, but crime shows, right?
Yeah.
Interestingly enough. And you act as both a consultant, but you also act as a consultant both for writers, I should say, and as well as for TV shows. So you were just on CNN pretty recently. But just talk to us about how you got into TV as well.
Sure. So once I retired, I actually moved to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil for a couple of years, and was living down there. And then a friend called me. He's retired from the FBI. He's a profiler, and he was working on a show called Criminal Minds on CBS, a very popular show. And they were starting a spin-off show. So Criminal Minds was the main show, and they started something called Criminal Minds Beyond Borders, which meant instead of every week the team going to a different city in the U.S. and working a case, this new show would go overseas. And Gary Sinise was our star. So I started as a technical advisor, which meant I would go on set and I would talk to the writers, and I would talk to the director, and I would talk to the actors about each scene, how they should act, and if they're going to pull their weapon out, what they should do, and if multiple people are going to have their weapons out, how they should, avoid crossfire situations and things like that. So I would advise them how to look authentic and not make mistakes that, it would be glaring and it wouldn't look good. And Gary was always very conscientious about wanting to look authentic. And so I started doing that, and I did that for 2 seasons. That show went off the air, but I got noticed by the people on the main show. And so I transitioned back over to the main show, which was in its 13th or 14th year on CBS. And I got into the writer's room. And so I was consulting with the writers then. I wasn't really on set with the actors. Now I'm in the writer's room. I'm learning how they write scripts, how they break a story, how they put the act structures together. And so by the time that show ended 2 years later, I was in there for 2 seasons in the writer's room. I got to co-write an episode. So I got to know how to write and write a TV script on an episodic show. And so then, from there, I got a job on another show for HBO Max and Nicole Kidman's company, with a great showrunner who mentored me, and we wrote 10 episodes of a streaming show, not a network broadcast show, but a streaming show. So I did that, and then I've been writing ever since. So I'm writing television scripts now. I've written a couple of pilots of my own based on my FBI experiences. I help other people write, and now I'm working on a feature film script as well, based on a experience I had in the FBI, and a novel, actually, a series of novels.
Well, what's it like though? Because you've had the experience, right? You've been there, you've done that, you've basically lived, what people make movies about, right? And that's a really cool thing, right? You've investigated the mafia, and all these big cases, and just as a field agent too. So when you're writing these, how the average person imagines an FBI agent is as, secretive, like government guy in a suit, sunglasses, comes to your door. We need to talk to you for a second, or we'll take it from here from the cops. And 90% of it's inaccurate, or a lot of it is.
Right.
So some movies do it better than others, and some shows definitely do as well. But when it comes to your experience of writing, have you encountered people that are just like wildly off in understanding how the FBI works? Like, what's that like when you're writing, having that experience?
Yeah, it is a little frustrating to see what we call tropes, right? They drag out this stuff. The FBI is going to come in and take over a case and things like that. In my 27 years in the FBI, I never took over somebody's case. I worked side by side with NYPD, LAPD, everybody else. We always got along really well. My partners in those departments, I'm still friendly with and talk to all the time. But yeah, it gets a little frustrating. There is a difference though, and even in some of the shows that I've either been a technical advisor on and written on, I've seen criticism from other people, other agents or other law enforcement in the field saying that show did this wrong, and because there have to be creative compromises made, and that was a big learning curve for me. And I actually had somebody that worked side by side with me, and they left the business because they were very frustrated with that. But it's a big learning curve. Storytelling, just because you've lived those stories like I have, doesn't mean you know how to tell those stories. And it's learning, and I've learned from writers that you have to learn how to tell a story. There's a dramatic narrative that's necessary, and not everybody that's lived it understands that. And there are beats that have to be played out and stuff. And so, I wouldn't say just because you've lived it, you can tell that story. Even if you can tell a story at a dinner party, doesn't mean you can tell that story in a novel or in a script. There are conventions that need to be kind of adhered to, and you have to learn from people, that are in the business, that are successful in this, and that do this all the time. And even if they haven't had those life experiences, they have the writing experiences that are valuable to somebody like me, to know how to put that story together, because you can live something for 27 years but try to tell it in 1 hour of television. It's a little different, and some stuff has to fall along the wayside. I remember one of the first scripts I wrote, this great start of a script, and the first 20 pages I thought were fantastic, and I handed to a friend that I respected, and they handed it back to me. He said, "Great scene, now take it from the 20 pages you have and put it into 2 pages." Imagine a 20-page story. Now you're being told you have to put it into 2 pages. You have to learn how that's a process. You can't fit everything in, and what can you fit in and how you fit it in is crucial. And so the art of writing is something that has to be learned, and so that's what I spent years, the first few years after my retirement, learning, and I'm still learning. It's a lifelong process. I'll learn from people I work with all the time, and I'm always watching new TV shows and breaking them down, analyzing them, talking to people about them, and seeing how different writers do different things. It's fascinating to me. So that's where I'm at now.
Well, one thing, this is going far back to the beginning of our conversation. So you spoke about how you investigated the mafia in the most stereotypical way that you would imagine the FBI investigating, the FBI existing in a mafia movie, either as undercover agents or in a van with binoculars, with the wiretaps, the literal wiretaps, right? It's not, where I forget how the term came about. I watched a video on it, but it was much more, what's the word I'm looking for? Hands-on, I guess. Wiretapping.
It was more analog, where now it's digital, and now it's beyond digital.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, how was that though? Because like you said it yourself. I mean, you're sitting there listening to the phone call of the head of the mafia or a crime organization that owns the cops and has money and all the organizations in an area, and the only people that can stop them is the federal government. And you're listening to the phone call of someone who is basically more powerful than the government there. What is that like, trying to not only investigate that person, what does that look like, but also how is it listening to those phone calls? Like what did you hear on those phone calls, if you can share?
Yeah, I mean, you hear a lot of different things. You hear funny things, you hear sad things, you hear private conversations. And one of the effects I didn't realize it would have on me is I became much more paranoid of my own. Like when I started doing a lot of wiretaps, and I did them right away, right when I was a new agent, because working the mafia, it's Title III of the U.S. Code is where it gives us the authority to do that. So you'll hear people say a T3 or a Title III. That's a wiretap. That's where we get the authorization. We have to go to court, get a court order to do that. But the effect it had on me, and again, I didn't realize it would, is that I started getting paranoid on my own telephone conversations when I was talking to, at that point I was single, girlfriends or whatever, and you'd be like, oh, don't say that. Like I would automatically, you lose a sense of privacy. Like we always, up until that point, I was so convinced that my communication was secure and nobody's listening on my phone, but because I never really listened to anybody else's phone, I didn't, that wasn't part of my world. And then all of a sudden I'm listening to these phone calls day and 10 hours a day, and then I go home and I'm on the phone. I'm like, this is not a real secure way to talk to somebody, because somebody could be listening in on me. And it just kind of had that effect where it kind of like, oh, you look at your own privacy a little differently when you're invading other people's privacy. Now we were doing it legally and we had every right to do it, and they were doing bad things, and that's why we were doing it, but we had wiretaps. I remember we had wiretaps in people's houses, not just on their phones, but we had like things under their coffee table. I remember in the afternoon, the guy who we were watching, his son would bring his girlfriend home after school, and you'd hear them fooling around on the couch, and like that's not something I want to listen to, but it's there. And however, we have, at that point, we have what's called minimization, their requirements. So you're allowed to kind of turn on the microphone, listen for 30 seconds to a minute. If you're hearing a conversation that's criminal in nature, you then can hit the record button and still record. If you don't hear anything, of a criminal nature, you have to turn off the machine and not listen. And then you periodically can kind of bounce back in, listen. If you don't hear anything criminal in nature, then you turn it off. So that's like, there's a minimization requirement on all those wiretaps. And so we would do that. We would listen in, even if they were talking, you'd listen in. If they're just talking about the day's events and not crimes, you have to shut it off. But if you turn it on and you're listening to the son and his girlfriend making out on the couch, you turn that off. But you hear a lot of, unfortunately, you hear a lot of personal stuff, and it's, it's creepy. You feel creepy a little bit, and again, it affects your own privacy, in your own private life. It did for me anyway.
Well, one thing, I mean, I don't know if I've spoken about it on the podcast now I'm thinking about it, but one thing I've kind of found interesting, especially in doing the podcast, is the idea of mass surveillance, right? And like, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with who Edward Snowden is, for example, right?
Sure.
I mean, I just had an NSA signals intelligence analyst on, and a former CIA officer too. He was both of those things. And I mean, I asked him, I said, how, I didn't say anything specific. I'm like, I'm not like, what do you think of mass surveillance? I'm like, but I did say, I'm like, with regards to things that the NSA has done or national security efforts, people tend to say that privacy is a problem. How can privacy exist in a world where everything needs to be watched, or everything can be watched, right? How can freedom? And I remember I walked in on a criminal law class, right, in my school, and I know the teacher, so I talk to her sometimes, or I just stay to listen to the class or say hi to her. And she's talking about how the Patriot Act did not violate the right to privacy, but instead the freedom of speech, right? Because you can't have the freedom of speech if you don't have the right to privacy, right? Those things they fought. So the point of that would be, when you're calling people now on the phone, right? You've seen how wiretaps have evolved. You've seen it up until now. We have these things, right? Where, everything can be tracked, everything can be monitored. So how does that look? Like, how did that look evolving? Like, if you can share with how it works now, because you can do it at a much greater distance. So how does it look now? And also, how do you feel on the phone now when you're talking to people?
Yeah, well, my career spanned this great, and I feel fortunate for this. When I got into the FBI in 1987, We didn't have cell phones. I don't even think, I think pagers came along around that time. We didn't have phones on our desks. We shared phones. It was like 5 desks pushed together, and we'd all face each other. And we didn't even have those cubicles that we had later. And they were just old big wooden desks, and there was like one phone for 5 of us, and it would ring, and you'd pick it up. And then pagers came along, and you'd get a page, and you'd have to find a payphone, and then hopefully you'd have a couple of quarters to put into the payphone. And most of the neighborhoods I worked, you wouldn't want to put that thing to your face, even if it did work. And so to what you're talking about today, where we all have these mini computers in our hands, right, that are 24/7 wired, everywhere in the world. That I can't even describe to you what a sea change that is for me. So when I would get, before you get a wiretap, you get what's called a pen register on a phone. So in the old days, if I had a pen register on your phone, it would record, not your voice, it would record the data. So it would record the date, time, the number you dialed, and the duration of your call to that number. And so I would see, okay, every Wednesday he's calling this number. Every Wednesday at 3:00, they're calling this number. Who is that? So you start, so you get some basic information. Now, when I would get the information off a pen register from the phone company, it would come in like 2 or 3 thick inches of paper. And I would sit there with a ruler, and each number that was there, I would copy onto an index card. And if I had this big wooden box of all the numbers that my subject, the guy I was looking at, called, and if he had called that number before, I would pull that card and I'd turn it over, and I would write the date and time in pen in this little tiny, as far as, because I wanted to fit as much as I could on that 3x5 index card, because we didn't have computers. And then later you would get all that 2 or 3 inches of information you'd get on a floppy disk, a 5.5, the big floppy disks. And then you could put into a computer, and the computer would kind of, do an organization. I'm like, this is great. Now I can look at, I could say, hey, how often does he call this number? Because previous to that, if I wanted to know how often he called a particular number, I would literally have to go and search every single 3x5 card for that number. I mean, it was unbelievable when I look back at it now. And then it went from there to now what they call PenLink, and all these different software things popped up. And I was out of the business by the time computers really came. I was already diving. I was doing forensic work. I was overseas. But now what they can do with all that information is unbelievable. Now, technology helps the bad guys too, because they can evade us as well. But it helped law enforcement, guys that are men and women that are conversant with computer systems and software and things like that. Boy, I don't know that I could go back if you threw me on a criminal squad in the FBI now, because I would have to take computer science classes. I would have to, because I'm just not that technical stuff. I have a hard time with my iPhone sometimes. And but yeah, the world has changed, and the information that the government can gather is enormous. The information that Google gathers on us is enormous. I don't know. Yeah, there's always civil liberties concerns with that stuff. And, the question of how it's used and who uses it and who has access to it, those are all really heady concerns.
Well, now, I mean, nowadays it's very different from just a simple wiretap, because now people have every type of electronic communication you can imagine. Messengers, they have messenger apps, they have Facebook, Instagram, they have Snapchat in some cases, email, or just regular phone. They have iMessage, but then even that, there's iMessage, there's SMS, there's FaceTime. There's 3 different ways to use your phone alone with its base settings to communicate with somebody without including an email. So with what you've seen, or what you can say about it, because I know there's always concerns with, how things currently go and what you can and can't say about it. But, from what you've seen and what you can share, how insane is that? Like, to be able to see if you have seen somebody's entire email list, like a book of all their texts, right? Like, have you?
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing. But also you have end-to-end encryption now, where some of that stuff is really difficult. I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, I think it's 20, maybe earlier, 2015, 2016, there was a terrorist event here in San Bernardino, California, not far from where I live. They shot up their own office Christmas party, killed a bunch of people. And we got their iPhone and it was locked, and Apple would not unlock it for us. They would not work with the FBI to unlock that iPhone, and we could not unlock it. It was really a weird thing. The FBI could not unlock it, and we gave it to we have a engineering research facility in Virginia, and those guys are like the Qs from James Bond. They can do all the gadget stuff and stuff. I think we ultimately got in that phone by hiring an Israeli hacking firm from Israel. And we hired them as a contractor to get into this iPhone because Apple would not do it for us. And we were stymied. And so there's this battle that goes on between private tech companies and the government as far as, and I'll tell you this story way back when this stuff was first starting. A boss of mine, I know, he was assigned to headquarters, and one of his things was they were doing what was called then the digital telephony bill. It was when telephones were first going digital. And he actually spent an entire long weekend in a hotel, locked in a hotel room with then Senator Al Gore, who was not vice president yet. He was a senator. And they were working on legislation about how the telephone companies would be, could we force the telephone companies to build a back door into their systems that they don't need. They don't need it. And so we would need it, though, to get into the digital information on some of this stuff. And they passed the law, and we were able to go in, but we would always need a court order. All of this stuff says we would have to still go like a Title III before a federal judge who's independent of us, and we would have to show him probable cause that we want to put a wiretap on, or we want to get these phone records or get into somebody's stuff. That's all still in place. But it started becoming, even when we had that order, we would go to the tech company and say, we can't do it. There's just no way. There's no physical way. There's no computer way to do what you're asking us to do. And so we started having to work with legislation to force the companies when they're building out their new systems and stuff. But, that was a battle that we won, and then we compromised, and then ultimately we lost. So now these tech companies can come up with, and either end-to-end encryption or different things where you just can't get in, and they can't even get in themselves. So if you go in and subpoena the records, they say, we don't have them. They're gone. These things aren't even kept. We only keep certain stuff to bill when we're billing people because they owe us money on it. But other than that, we don't keep the data. And so it's gone. And so, there's this kind of battle always going on between government and tech and what they're doing, and can our people kind of stay up with the latest, and it's always going to be that way.
Well, one thing about the Apple case that was interesting was that, and I know the case you're talking about, Apple. I'm sorry, not Apple. Okay, so the FBI subpoenaed Apple, or not, they didn't subpoena Apple. They were just asking, could you please decrypt it for us? I believe Tim Cook was the CEO at the time, but Apple themselves basically said, no, we won't do that because we don't want to set that precedent. Mm-hmm. And I think it was Tim Cook looking back, but he basically didn't want to do it because if he does it once, then it sacrifices the security of all the users. Now, this is very different 7 years later, when now Apple will claim, yes, like they say they're private, but it's not really that far beyond them to work with the federal government on different cases. You don't hear about those cases anymore, right? And another thing too is that when it comes to big tech versus the government, I will say that the government usually tends to win in some way, right? Now that could be because like Pegasus, like the spyware that came out recently, where a private company, basically whoever wanted to buy it, the biggest buyer, could basically just go out and say, hey, we want this spyware to be sent to this guy, and without even getting a text in some cases, or it would be a virus hidden within a text, right? I think the president of Saudi Arabia, or the king, whatever, actually did that to Jeff Bezos. Gavin DeBecker was talking about it, where I guess the prince or the king or whatever, he did ask him, he's like, hey, at a party, like, hey, can I have your phone number? And he did then eventually send him a text with an embedded image that got into Jeff Bezos' phone. What he got from that, Gavin DeBecker didn't share, and he didn't share all the details about it. But
Right.
it is scary also what private companies can do for the highest bidder, right? What contractors can do. I think Eric Prince. Do you know who Eric Prince is? Yeah, former head of Blackwater. He has his own startup now, actually, who it's called Unplugged. And the inventor or the head technology guy he hired for Unplugged is actually the guy who made Pegasus. So
it's
that kind of makes yeah.
I mean, and I'm sure you know this. The FBI sends people to hacker conventions, and we sometimes try to hire hackers. Because they know, and we unfortunately we can't pay them as much as some of the tech companies can pay them. But there's always that, and quite frankly, in some of the tech companies, a lot of retired FBI agents that I know are in those security departments of those tech companies.
Right. Actually, interestingly enough, I have emails with. Do you know who Chris Tarbell is?
No.
He worked in the New York field office. He what's it called? He was in a different department than you. He was in the tech. No, I think it was the tech department.
I
don't know. Either way, he was the man who investigated and eventually caught Russ Ulbricht for the Silk Road. I asked him to come on the show. He said yes, just not right now. So he will hopefully come on eventually. But with him, and he investigated Russ Ulbricht. Russ Ulbricht was, dark web drug market, right, to put it simply. And he obfuscated his everything. But eventually the FBI did find him. And there was a question at some point, I think, I don't know if it's ever been confirmed, that the NSA actually did work with the FBI in order to surveil him. I don't know how true that is. But when it comes to the NSA, for example, right, like the National Security Agency, they've been known to basically spy on people, right? That's a documented thing. In your experience, would the FBI work with the NSA if they needed the information?
Yeah, I mean, if we could do it legally, sure. Because now the FBI has a foreign counterintelligence section, right, of it, and those guys are different than us. I worked criminal matters my whole career. So whenever we're working criminal matters, if your ultimate goal, as mine always was, is to put somebody in jail, to indict them, put them on trial, convict them, or if they plead guilty, you can make a deal with them. When you're doing that, that all of your sources and methods, all of your things are going to be turned over to the defense and in open court challenged legally before a judge or before appellate courts, maybe ultimately before the Supreme Court. So we couldn't do too many shady things. And that was one of the things after 9/11, we had problems with the CIA torturing people and then sending them to Guantanamo, and then them falling in our lap to try to get them convicted in a criminal court in the United States after the FBI, the CIA has already violated, U.S. laws by doing this torture stuff, and then, crap rolls downhill, and then the FBI has got their hands dirty because now we can't convict these people because they've been, we can't do that. We can't torture people. That's not what we do. And so we would work with NSA, but if it's a criminal agent that's working it, he would have to make sure that everything's on the up and up, or else that evidence is going to be suppressed. A federal judge is not going to let a jury see that stuff. And so you could lose the case. So, and sometimes guys have to go free. Criminals get away with it because even though you could have the evidence, if it's obtained illegally, you can't use it in the criminal court and stuff. And so you would never go after the guy, maybe never even arrest him. So yes, they would. But if they're doing it in a criminal case, in a criminal investigation, hopefully put that person in jail, you've got to do it on the up and up, or else a good defense attorney is going to find that stuff and get a suppression hearing and get that evidence suppressed, and the jury will never see it.
Well, my question would be that if the FBI has the power to subpoena people, which they definitely do, right? They absolutely do. And they almost never get turned down. So the question is that if the NSA has those records, right? And this has been well documented through Snowden. This isn't anything new, right? That they have all these millions and millions of records of all the phone calls of every American, all the emails, all the, whatever form of communication. They have, the ability to look up an email address or whatever name. Like, let's just say your name, Bobby, right? I look up Bobby Chacon, and I put it in the search bar, and everything that you've ever searched on Google, I probably would have to look for a little bit, what age, what name, whatever, more specific about you, get to you, and I see everything about you, right? And if the NSA has those records and the FBI wants them, that is technically illegal action, right? So why would that be wrong necessarily? Like when it would become shady if the NSA has documented that they have those records?
But if they unlawfully obtain them, it all depends on if they've unlawfully obtained them, right? If they unlawfully obtain them, then we couldn't use them. There's a legal doctrine called fruits of the poisonous tree, where if there's an illegal act in the beginning and stuff flows out from that, so the tree and then the fruit comes out of it, and I pluck an apple off that tree, even though the apple's fine, it's a valid apple, it's legitimate, but it's from a poisonous tree because the tree was never supposed to be. I can't use that apple. It's fruits of the poisonous tree doctrine. And so even if I legally obtained it through a subpoena from NSA, if NSA illegally obtained that, if there's some judge that said that was illegally obtained, you shouldn't have done that or whatever, then my subpoena of those records it gets tossed. I can't use that because of the fruits of the poisonous tree doctrine. I can't benefit now, even if I'm up on the up and up, I can't benefit from somebody else having broken the law previously.
All right. So, well, this is an interesting question then, because multiple courts, I believe, because after Snowden leaked it all, it did get investigated. And I'm sure you're aware of that. So Snowden leaks it, it gets investigated, and it's ultimately deemed illegal. The program is ultimately deemed illegal. Now, has it stopped? No. Right? Have those programs stopped? Probably not. I don't know personally. I haven't seen it, but it's kind of safe to say that that's probably not the case. Now, the question then becomes that, and I should preface it with one more thing. Even recently, Tucker Carlson, he got monitored by the NSA, right? I'm going to explain the symbol of the story, but he gets a text message one day from what I would assume to be his friend. And he's like, "Hey, are you coming to Hey, you're coming to Washington, I heard, or, let's go meet up for lunch." And they go meet up, and he says to Tucker, he goes, "Hey, so I heard you're going to meet with Vladimir Putin, right?" And he's like, "How the hell did you know that?" And Tucker gets like super concerned. And then he goes, "Well," and then his friend says to him, "Well, that's because the NSA was monitoring you, right? Because of whatever. They just were." And he's like, how do you know that? And he trusts the person. He never revealed their name. But this was before the recent Putin interview. This was years ago, like I think a year and a half ago, right? And he revealed that the NSA was monitoring him, so on and so forth. He calls a senator. They do an inquiry into it, and they do find that the NSA was monitoring him. And the NSA admits to it eventually, and they're like, "Yes, but we had a good reason." Now, I guess what I'm getting at here is that the NSA does not have any criminal authority, right? Theoretically, right? They're kind of a terrorist prevention organization. There are a lot of things. But when it comes to that, if all he wants to do is interview Putin, right? And he's going to try to interview Vladimir Putin. They don't have any criminal authority. So if they're monitoring him, what's ultimately their purpose, I guess? Just for the hell of it, or?
That's a good question. I'm not very unfamiliar with the NSA oversight, who they report to, the things they do. Obviously, as you know, they operate in the shadows, and I am not in those shadows. And so I was always a little bit leery of them and the information that comes out of them. My understanding is they collect information for policymakers, and for, operational intelligence reasons, but I've always had a little bit of a problem with the intelligence community in the United States, what they call, which, by the way, the FBI is part of, in that I have always found there's very little accountability there, because as I explained to you earlier, my biggest accountability, the thing that held me most accountable, was I was going to be standing next to a federal prosecutor, standing in front of a federal judge. And on the other side of me was going to be a very high paid defense attorney that's going to attack my case to the judge on current laws. And so I had to dot my I's, cross my T's, and operate within the law and the Constitution, or else my case was going to get thrown out. Could be sanctioned both by the court and by the FBI. The intelligence community doesn't seem to have the same oversight. They don't seem to have to operate the same way that I had to. And it was a bit frustrating at times. And, in the lead up to 9/11, that was a problem because the CIA knew certain things that they were not sharing with the FBI, including two of the hijackers living in San Diego, when we asked them at least 5 different times about those two people, and they refused to give us the information. And so, I've always had a bit of an issue with the intelligence community, as a whole, and even our FBI people that are on that side of the house, on the intelligence side. I just think there's not enough accountability there. There's not enough oversight. And sometimes
Yes.
they get it wrong,
Yeah.
and get it wrong, as in there's no WMDs in Iraq. There doesn't seem to be any price to pay. Nobody gets fired. Nobody gets admonished. It's just, oh, we got it wrong. The intelligence was wrong. There were no WMDs in Iraq. Oh, okay. We just started a war over it. But okay.
Right. Nobody gets blamed.
Nobody loses the job. Nobody gets demoted. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of accountability on that side.
Which is very different from the FBI, where people are known to get fired, for various things, right? But, because the way I've always seen it is that the FBI is basically the super police, right, of America. It's a funny way of putting it, but like the, police without borders within America, right? In a way.
Only in America. We have 90 overseas offices. I was assigned overseas several times. We operate globally. My friends are always like, oh, I thought the CIA operated globally. You guys have, no, we both operate. We operate globally, and the CIA operates globally. And we have 90 overseas offices. It's very uncommon now for an FBI agent to go their whole career without being assigned overseas at some point. So yeah, we have a lot of different roles, and I shun the label super police only because I've worked my whole career with partners who were detectives, either NYPD or LAPD or Long Beach PD, and those guys are great. And my dad was an NYPD detective sergeant. My brother was. They're the best detectives in the world. I know a lot of those, all of those guys. I grew up with them, and everybody has strengths. Everybody has weaknesses. Every organization has strengths and weaknesses. Every organization has superstars and people that are not so good. And there's corruption in every law enforcement agency to some extent, including the FBI. And so, we're all, I just don't like that we're superior to anybody. We have a large jurisdiction. Granted, we cover more crimes than almost anybody. And every year it seems like there's more crimes added to the federal code. And so we do cover a lot of different crimes, and it's one of the reasons I went into the FBI, because the variety of different crimes I was going to be able to investigate. But yeah, we operate globally, and we have a lot of different types of crimes we look into. We have a lot of different specialties. We even have we already talked about, an intelligence side of the house that doesn't involve criminal investigations at all. So I was never really part of that world in the FBI, but I was in almost every other world.
Right. Well, what I mean by super police is really just, that's my definition of it. That's the way I think about it, is just, police with more resources, right? Basically, right? Yes, there's times where they'll operate outside of the country. Yes, there's times where they'll operate very well within the country, most of it. But when I say super police, I just mean like police, like with all the police, all the resources of an average police officer, but more, right? Like more resources, greater jurisdiction of your crime, and again, a lot of resources. The FBI has a lot of resources.
Yeah.
And also say in certain things, because like you're saying with the tech companies, for example, if they subpoena a company, the company usually is less likely to fight it, I would say. Right.
And as I said to you earlier, some of that is the guy receiving it at the company is a retired FBI agent in their subpoena
Right.
department. So it
Right.
just makes it a little easier.
Right. Exactly. And yeah, that's my point. So, right. And so what I was trying to get at with, I guess, the topic of the NSA and the government surveilling people, but then also the government being incapable of doing certain things. Right. Because
Yeah.
terrorist attacks still do happen. Right.
Yeah.
They did not disappear when the Patriot Act was signed.
No.
Right. And, obviously that pisses a lot of people off, considering that, for all the surveillance, it seems like the CIA and NSA aren't really capturing all too many terrorists, right? There aren't that many reported capturings. Now, maybe there are, maybe there aren't.
Have the additional, we've actually gone back to the Stone Ages now, because now tech, no matter how high tech you are surveilling people, when you have 10 million people crossing the southern border who are unvetted and don't have chips in their skin and don't have driver's licenses and don't have any paperwork, now you have tens of millions of people, some of them terrorists, some of them foreign intelligence agents, now coming into the country completely unvetted. We don't know who they are, where they are. We can't surveil them. We can surveil American citizens a lot easier than these tens of millions of people that have in recent years come across the southern border and still to this day are flooding across our southern border. We don't know who they are. We don't know where they're from. We don't know anything about them. We don't have their fingerprints on file. We don't have any biometric data on them. We don't have email addresses. We have nothing. I mean, and they're here, and they're in every city in America, and a lot of them are criminals.
Unfortunately, yes, unfortunately. And, Secretary Mayorkas is being impeached as of recently. Will that happen? I have no idea. I mean, we all know how slow politicians are, right? When it doesn't involve them making money, it tends to go very, very slowly. Right. And
yeah.
So it's obviously this is an issue, right? With people coming in illegally, and it's been an issue. And it reminds me of a conversation I actually had with a former CIA analyst. Her name is Sarah Adams. She was the head of the Benghazi investigation. And this is partly to your point also about a lack of accountability in some cases. Now, Sarah is great, and I liked having her on my show a lot, and she was very fun to talk to and very interesting and very insightful. One thing she actually said that kind of fascinated me was the fact that Al-Qaeda, she's like, if you asked me a few years ago about Al-Qaeda and how big they are, she would have said that they're smaller than ever. But then she goes and she says, but now if you ask me, I would say Al-Qaeda is bigger than they've ever been. Now, you've worked in terrorism, and what are your thoughts on that statement? Right? Like, you've worked in those cases a lot of times. So for her to say that Al-Qaeda is now bigger after we fought this whole war, signed every bill in the world that has broken every international treaty, all this stuff, but the result seems to be that Al-Qaeda still exists, disappeared for a bit, came back, and people aren't really talking about it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, it never really disappeared. What happens is there are ebbs and flows of these things. It's like a virus. It's like COVID will always be with us. We can tamp it down depending on our behavior and our medicines and things. So when you look at Al-Qaeda, when it seemed to be smaller and we had it under control, what were we doing then that made it happen? And so every time you take your foot off somebody's throat, they start to breathe again and things get bigger. So we had a much more active overseas presence. We were going after them in every corner of their world. The minute you draw back, they're going to flourish again. And you can go in and you can tamp it down again. The minute you pull back, they flourish again. So they're like a virus. You take all the precautions. You wear gloves, you social distance, you whatever you do. But then the minute you stop doing that, it can flourish again. So that's why Al-Qaeda was small. When we were using all those tools, we had special operations going everywhere in the world. But how long can you possibly sustain that? How long can you have all of these overseas engagements, all of these special operations units going overseas? It's expensive. And it not only from a financial point, it's expensive humanitarily. You're getting people killed, you're getting them maimed. So what appetite do we have to stay engaged overseas and keep them, at bay? Because the minute you take your foot off the gas, it's going to happen again. And so I think that's why I think she was right that, they were big, then they got small, then they got bigger again. You have to look at, well, what were we doing during that time period when they were small? And then what did we do that may have caused them to flourish again? And so that I think is the analysis that has to take place. And then once you do that analysis and you realize the things that we did that worked to kind of make them smaller, do we have the appetite and the fortitude to keep those things in place? Maybe not. As a society, do we want to be spending our limited resources to do that, to send young men and women overseas in those situations? And can we do it? Can we keep invading countries, and do we want to do that? Do we want to be occupiers? So it's the appetite of the American public will determine whether or not we will spend, through our elected representatives, we will spend our resources in doing that. Right after 9/11, the appetite was very strong. Spend all the money you can, send everybody overseas, go get them, and then, 20 years later, when we haven't had a major terrorist attack, that appetite lessens and people say, you know what, let's feed the hungry. Let's take care of stuff in our own country. Let's pull all those people back. We've had enough wounded warriors coming back, and then, who know, then when that presence isn't as pressurized overseas, those groups will reform and they will get stronger. And if their ultimate goal is to attack us again, then it could happen.
Well, when it comes to the investigations that you've done, because you've done in many different types of investigations into many different types of people. So one, I guess, type of people that you've investigated, especially, is people in a position of power, right? Granted, criminal power, but a position of power, right? So that being mafia or terroristic, right? And so when it comes to, for example, you investigating a guy in the mafia, right? And then you have a terrorist leader, right? I said this to Sarah. I said, the mafia I'm sorry, not the mafia, the terrorist organizations tend to act like a very extreme mafia, right? And in the sense that you can't really negotiate with them because they want to be talked to like they're powerful, basically, right?
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that statement? Like that you can't really have a diplomatic relationship with any type of terrorist?
Well, I agree. I agree because you have to look at what the ultimate goal, right? So the ultimate goal for the mafia guys was just simply to make money. They were just, whatever made them money, they were going to make money. The ultimate goal of a terrorist organization is not money. They don't care about money. They're there to wreak terror, to bring terror upon whoever they're against, right? Israel, the United States, whatever. And so there's, if that's their ultimate objective, it's really hard to discuss anything with people like that because they are so radicalized. They're so hell bent on causing that terror wherever they can. It's a whole different animal. I could actually talk to my mafia guys, kind of understand them, that they're just out for the money. And then I would tell some of them, like, look, if you put, as industrious as you are and smart as you are, with all this, shady stuff that you're doing, if you actually put that into a real career, you'd be, an executive at some company because you're a hardworking person. You're all for money. You're very financially driven. That's all you want to do is get money, money, money. Well, that's all an executive in some, Fortune 500 company wants to do too. They're just doing it legally, right? With a terrorist, it's not that. They don't care about money. They just want to kill people or cause terror for their cause, whatever that be. It's a much different animal to deal with. And like you said, it's much, much, much harder to deal with.
Well, when I referenced that statement that you can't really negotiate with terrorists and that it's like an extreme mafia, is in the sense that they both use fear. They both use intense fear. Now, granted, different types of fear, right? But ultimately the same idea. Now, for example, in the mafia, you don't really hear. I mean, let me rephrase what I'm about to say. I was gonna say you don't hear about explosives being used, but you do. I mean, like there are car bombings that have happened, but I was trying to get at more the idea of they're in a terrorist organization, given that they've made basically entire countries kind of fall to their knees, right?
Hmm.
And they've done it to such an extreme where the Taliban has taken over the entire country of the country we pulled out of. I think Afghanistan. Yeah,
Yeah.
Afghanistan. So they basically taken over the entire country, and we saw this years ago when Joe Biden pulled out. Now, was that right or wrong? I mean, we all wanted to get out of the war, but regardless of that, when it comes to the difference between the psychology, you're saying that the motive is just different. But I'm saying though that the methods, right, are very, very similar, right? It's
Yeah.
if you speak out against us, we will kill you,
Right.
or it's mainly kill, right? The
Right.
mafia seems like they could have used bribery more so or blackmail, but when you think of a terrorist organization, you do think of them just killing, right? Being a
Sure.
little bit more animalistic. Does that remain true or
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and we saw it a lot in like outlaw motorcycle gangs, like the Hells Angels or something. You didn't fall. You didn't. If you were a Hells Angels member, you were in for life, just like a terrorist organization. You didn't get out. You didn't say, "Okay, I'm not going to do this anymore," because they'd kill you. And like the Hells Angels and some of the Mongols and some of these other groups, they'd kill you in a horrific way. And so you didn't speak out against them, and you didn't leave the gang. The outlaw motorcycle gangs were much more like that than say the mafia was. But yeah, they would go after you, your family, whatever, and to make sure you stayed in line. So in that sense, yeah, there is a parallel.
do you know Michael Francis or
Sure.
Francesi?
Yeah. Hmm.
Have you spoken to him before?
No, I'm actually John Panisi is somebody that I work with. I don't know if you know John. He's a former member of the Lucchese crime family. He's got a
I've heard
YouTube.
the name before. I've heard the
Yeah,
name before.
he has a YouTube channel, and he breaks down the mob issues very well. And John and I work together. It's Penisi, I think, John.
Yeah.
And yeah, he's a former mobster. Spent a large portion of his life in jail. Good, I say good guy. We get along real well, and we work together real well. And we're working on a few projects now together. But I know Francis too. I know I know who he is. I've never really worked with him in that respect. But John, I work with often, talk to him often. Yeah, and yeah.
Well, it's interesting that you're saying that because this is a question I wanted to ask Matthew Cox. I don't know if you know who Matt Cox is.
No.
Matthew Cox is former most wanted fugitive. I think both the FBI and the Secret Service, definitely the Secret Service.
Hmm.
He went to federal prison for 13 years. He was on the run from the feds, the U.S. everything in the book. He
Right.
stole $55 million in every type of fraud that you can imagine.
Wow.
Right. And when the FBI came to him, they said he didn't even know how much money he stole. They're like, you stole $55 million, right? Something absurd. And anyways, when I talked to him, I wanted to ask him, what is the relationship like when you're talking to an FBI agent? Like, because he has his own podcast now. It's
Mhm.
called Inside True Crime. I like it. It's pretty cool. But he interviews a lot of FBI agents, former FBI agents, I should say. Even like Jim Diorio, who I also had on, but he interviews them, he talks to them, kind of like basically what I do, right, in person. But what is that relationship like, considering that you investigated that guy, basically, right?
Right.
Like you've investigated, maybe not him. Well, was it him directly? Like
No.
yeah,
No.
but you've investigated similar people,
His
right? Is
family,
my point.
the same family. But he
Yeah.
came. He's a little younger than me, so he came into the family a little after me. After I had already left and gone out I was working the cartels when he became a made guy. But look, John, he denounced the mafia. He came out. He spent 17 years in jail, I think, for murder. And he denounced. He was a made guy. Went through the ceremony of being a made mafia member. But then he denounced them, and he's probably got a price on his head for that. And he's secret about where he lives, but he's very public and on his YouTube channel and stuff, and he's paid his price to society. And who am I to judge? I mean, he went to jail, he served his time, and now he's out, and that's our system of justice. I can't argue with that. But I can't say, oh, he shouldn't be doing that, and he was a bad guy. I mean, when you serve, I had lunch, I don't know, last year or the year before, with a guy who spent he had spent like 55 years in jail. He was in his 70s, and he went to jail when he was like 19, and he may have been close to 80. And we had a long conversation. Then we had dinner after a couple of weeks after that, and I found him to be personable, and he served his time. He was serving a life thing, but because he became a certain age, he was eligible for this. I forget what they call it. It's like a compassionate release, because he's almost 80 or whatever, or 70s, and he was in since he was 19. Look, people pay their. Even when I was working at the Jamaican drug gangs, these were street level crack dealers in New York, and it was really bad and stuff. But some of these kids were very young. They got roped into this life early on. They didn't have a family to rely on. They didn't have a good school to go to, and I looked at their life circumstances, and I understood the choices they made. I think they were bad choices, but I understood them making those choices, because they weren't given the same opportunities that I had been given in my life. I grew up in a suburban, middle class suburban neighborhood. These kids were being raised in a broken family, in a very oppressed, urban environment, and they didn't have the opportunities. And so, I didn't think they were bad people. I just think they were put in bad situations, and they made the decisions that they made, and I understood them. And I didn't hold that against them. I would never think they were evil. Now, talking about the serial killer cases I worked, those are evil people. They were always going to be evil. The last serial killer I worked, he hung himself in jail, and I was only not glad about it because we had more victims that we wanted to find of his, and he took them to his grave. But he was a guy that was beyond redemption. I would never, ever think anything bad about him. But most of the criminals that I was able, that I put in jail, most of them are out now. Well, some of them are doing life, but some of them went to the witness protection program after they served their time. And then, I still talk to them occasionally and stuff, and they've redeemed themselves. They paid their price. And who am I to judge them after the system has said what it said, and they complied with their punishment, and now they're out. So, it's that's it. I'm not a judge, and I've recently served on a jury, as surprising as that sounds, but yeah, that's like with John. He's paid his price, his debts to society, and he's redeemed himself, and he's renounced that life. And unlike Sammy the Bull, who got out of jail or got out of his protection program and then became the biggest ecstasy dealer in Arizona, he couldn't stay on the straight and narrow. But some of these guys do get on. They get out and they go on the straight and narrow, and I can't judge him for that.
Well, actually, Matt Cox, he did. I can't retell you his full story, because if he were to tell you his full story, detail by detail, he was on Lex Friedman's podcast. I don't know if you're familiar with Lex Friedman. Yes, he was on his show, and he told me, right, during my interview with him, he's like, he said to Lex, right, or Lex asked him, he's like, how long did you think we went for? He went for 7 hours and like 30 minutes telling his full story during the full interview, right? So imagine everything you're doing in a day, 7 hours.
Yeah.
And the actual interview that got uploaded is 6 hours. It's 6 hours on the dot.
Oh
so
God.
He cut so much out.
Yeah.
But I mean, okay. So anyways, about him, he did violate his parole multiple times, actually. But one thing, and you're going to find this funny, he was so good at conning people, right? Because he figured out a way to basically make fake shot records and fake birth certificates. And I don't know if you know what that's the recipe for, but that's a social security number, right? Yeah. And so he would get one, and then he would get the other, or because okay, basic telling of a story. He figured out, like, one day when he's about to fill out a W-2, he goes to an accountant, and they basically tell him, oh yeah, just use whiteout, right? And he's like, what? You can do that? And she's like, no, but everybody does it. And then he basically gets into realizing that he's like, wait, nobody cares. And he makes money off of this. Anyways, at one point he does make, he figures out all these different ways to con people. One of the ways that he conned people, he would make entirely fake people into existence, right? He would literally get fake social security numbers or real social security numbers. I'm sorry. And he would use a shot record and a birth certificate, and he figured out ways to do it. And he would literally make these whole fake people that didn't exist. He would get a real driver's license under a fake name. He would literally go to the DMV as one of the most wanted criminals in the country, and they would give him a license.
Yeah.
But with him, it got to a point where he would go to court under a fake person. He would get speeding tickets under a fake person that didn't exist.
Right.
That he put into the system, basically.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But he did violate parole multiple times. I mean, when I also interviewed him and when Lex interviewed him, he does have a lot of regrets, though. An insane amount of regrets. And he even admitted that most guys are like, oh, well, it made me the man I am today. You know, when I think it was Lex, he's like, would you do it all again? He's like, no. You know, he said no.
Because I said earlier, you think about a guy like that with the brains they had to do that. If he actually channeled that into a legitimate enterprise, he could be an Elon Musk, he could be a Jeff Bezos, because guys like that are smart, they're not dumb, right? And they're able to juggle all of these. I couldn't do it. I couldn't be a con man like that, but they're able to juggle all of these different things in their minds all at once, and it makes sense to them, and they can actually do stuff efficiently, thinking and get things done. Business pays a lot of money for guys like that. You know what I mean? There are businesses that pay a lot of money for people that can get that kind of stuff done. And then he'd have a very healthy 401k plan. He'd have a very healthy, whatever, and it would all be legitimate. He'd still have all that money in the bank somewhere. And, so I think that's where the regret comes in, where, you paid your restitution and stuff, but a lot of the money that he probably earned is gone. But if he had done that, if it was legitimate, he would be some corporate, fixer, that could travel internationally and say, oh, I can do that. I can fix that for you, legitimately, and because guys that have that ability, I've met some of them, those con men, I could not do what they do because their minds are they're so organized, and they're able to do things, and they're always doing multiple cons at one time and stuff. And so it was fascinating to me. I didn't really work fraud. I had a couple of fraud parts of cases, RICO cases that I did, where I would bring in IRS CID agents to help me with that stuff, because those guys really knew that stuff. But I don't think I wasn't good enough at math and that whole thing to really figure out some of those complicated fraud schemes. A good friend of mine did the Bernie Madoff case in the New York office. He was a diver on the team as well in New York, and we sat, and he was trying to tell me about the case one time, and I don't even understand what you're saying, like how it all worked, like the inner workings of it and stuff. So I don't think I would have been a very good fraud investigator.
Well, one thing I will say again is, well, I was actually on a buddy of mine. He invited me to his studio, and we did an interview. He kind of interviewed me, right? It was fun. Mm-hmm. And he was a YouTuber I was a fan of for years too. And we ended up talking. Very, very incredible guy, super generous. And he told me about Matt Cox. Because this was before I had him on the show, and he's like, when we referenced him during my interview, he's like, look, one thing that everybody that knew Matt Cox says is that he would have been great at anything. And his story is it's very tragic. I'll say that, because, and I was thinking about this the other night. I'm like, it's tragic. It really is. Because when you get to like his core of like who he is and who he was, it wasn't like he was this evil guy that's like, man, I can't wait to screw people over. He even admitted that he's been in jail with guys like that. When I interviewed Scott, he knows people that he investigated like that, where they're bragging about how easy it is to scam old people and leave them penniless. And oh yeah, I can steal all this money from them. Real true con men.
Right.
But when you get to Matt Cox is really just a storyteller that just wanted to, kind of live like a lavish life. And he ultimately only stole from the banks and the government, right? And that's what got him in trouble eventually. And I mean, he does have a lot of regrets, and more power to him. But he even admitted, he's like, look, he's 54. He's only a little bit older than my dad, right? And he's sitting there with a son that doesn't want to talk to him, and you know, he even says, he's like, my son has a good reason not to talk to me.
Right.
Like, after everything I've done, my son has a very good reason not to want to associate.
Yeah.
But and it's sad. It really is, because I like the guy. I don't, he's not somebody that I think deserved, I guess, like everything. Yes, did he do a lot of stupid things? Absolutely. But to be 54 with that much regret, it's sad.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, you're right. Absolutely. Absolutely it is. And that's the, that's the sad part of those stories. But yeah, you have to take everybody as an individual. And like I said, there are some people, former mobsters, like John, who renounced the life. And then there's guys like Sammy who couldn't stay on the straight and narrow, if you paid them to do it. And so, yeah, there are different people sometimes who are just bad at the core, to their core. And some of them aren't. And you just make those judgments.
Now, you mentioned working on serial killer cases. Now, this is going to be a super broad question, and it's probably the most like movie type of question I could ask you. But who is the most evil person that you think you've ever investigated or put behind bars?
Uh, uh, it would come down to two or three, I think. But the serial killer Israel Keys, who I didn't put behind bars, my role in that case was recovering his last victim. I was running the dive team at the time, so the case agents and the case detectives on the Anchorage PD and the Anchorage office of the FBI were the ones that kind of made the case against Keys and put him in jail. Well, plus, we got the body. We recovered her body, and it was at the bottom of a frozen lake north of Anchorage, Alaska. And so they needed the body to prove the murder, right? And so once we got the body back, then they charged him. But so I was part of that team that put him in jail. I would guess you'd say he was already in jail, but part of the team that solidified the case against him once we found Samantha's body, or she was dismembered, her body parts, and recovered her. That solidified the case against him, and he was pure evil. And after he hung himself in jail, the FBI released all of his interrogation tape. So you can literally go on YouTube and search Israel Keys. And there's a book written about him called American Predator, of which a chapter is about me and my dive team. And you can watch those videos. And my wife has watched them because she was in the background watching while I was preparing for some TV shows that I was on related to Israel Keys. And you see him chuckling about it, you see him laughing, and you can see him describing some of the acts that he carried out. And it's chilling because there is not an ounce of decency in that guy's body. He's dead now, but he hung himself, coward. He took the coward's way out. But there was not an ounce of goodness in his soul. I think he was just a dark soul. He was born without a soul, maybe. I'm not a psychologist, but he was an evil person to his core. And he knew it. He kind of acted like he knew it. I mean, he tells a story of going out into the woods when he was a kid, at like 15, and he brought his friend with him, and he tied a cat to a tree and set it on fire, and the cat ran around until the rope was wrapped all around the tree and then died, and his friend vomited. His friend just threw up and couldn't stay with this cruelty. And Keys looked at his friend at 15 years old and couldn't understand why his friend was upset. And that's when he knew, I'm different. And he says this. He says, I knew at that moment that I couldn't share the real me with anyone else, because that guy is not me, because I would never be upset or vomit at the cruelty that he was carrying out, right? Most of us would, but he was this next level evil kind of guy. And then thereafter, that was his epiphany, where I have to keep this part of myself to me secret. And he was a secret serial killer for the next 20 years.
One common trait, yeah. Well, one common trait of serial killers that I've noticed in like a lot of their interviews is that they tend to take, it's more than just sadism, because when people think sadism, they think of just pleasure from inflicting suffering, but a lot of them also tend to seem to have some form of amusement, like curiosity. Like kind of like how a child would if they saw an ant, like trying to pull all its legs off, sort of
Mhm.
thing.
Right,
Where
right.
it's less of just evil, but it's also like a separation. Like they're distant from like being a human in a way, right?
Well, don't see their victim as human. You see,
Right.
like,
Yeah.
or at least on their level, they're like that moth that you're going to tear the one wing off and watch it go in a circle. When they have somebody tied up and they're torturing them, you're right. They have this childlike curiosity. Oh, well, what if I do this or what if I do that? Why are they screaming? And it's pleasure, but it's also that curiosity. Like you say, I think you're right.
All right. Yeah. And I mean, I'm gonna ask a few lightning questions for you right
Yeah,
now. Nothing interview.
because I gotta in about 15
Yeah.
minutes an LA TV station.
All right. Yeah. So okay. So a few lightning questions. Do you have any advice to young people?
Stay in school, do well in school, get an education. It still counts. And learn computers, because that's one thing I didn't do. And I'm in a world that I can't imagine the world. I'm old. So after I go in a couple of years, I can't imagine, if you don't know computers, but everybody's, everybody's being raised on computers now, but I'm a dinosaur. But learn computers, stay in school. I know it sounds like it sounds cliche, but stay in school, get a degree if you can, focus on computers, because that's the world, tech and computers.
Any advice to people in general?
No, I don't know that I'm qualified to do that. Just be kind. The older I get, the more I'm like, just be kind. It doesn't cost you anything. It just, people have different opinions. They have different lifestyles. And, I get frustrated with people who disagree with me sometimes or have different worldviews, but I try to always kind of take a step back and just kind of realize that we're all, kind of all in this together. And even if we have different opinions on major topics, it's okay.
Any major regrets from your career as an FBI agent?
Um, I think I retired a little too soon. I retired when I was like 51, I think, and FBI is a mandatory retirement at 57. I would have probably liked to stay another couple of years, but my life situation, my wife was working down in Brazil, and so we moved down there. But nothing, no major. Nothing from my career. I did everything I wanted to do in the FBI. I had a great career. I was the first full-time FBI agent diver in the history of the FBI. So I broke some new ground. I created a program that didn't exist before I was there. Um, I served 2 tours of duty in Iraq for the FBI. I lived a year in Greece. They worked out of the embassy in Greece for a year for the FBI. I traveled around. I mean, it was a great career. And, my only regret was maybe I ended it a little early.
Biggest thing that you've learned from your career as an FBI agent or life in general?
As we kind of touched on, don't judge people. People make decisions in their lives, and we're all fighting different battles in our lives. And I learned that early on when I was sitting with kids that were working for drug cartels, because they didn't have the opportunities I knew that I had, and they had to make those decisions. And I didn't judge them for making those decisions. And every time I had a chance to help them, make a deal with the prosecutors or something like that, if I felt that they were going to carry through and do the right thing, if we put them back on the right track, I would try to do that. And so, yeah, so don't judge people, even if you think they've made really bad life choices, because we all come from different environments, and you don't know that was probably a decision that may have been not kind of made for them by circumstance, or environment. So I think that don't judge people too harshly or too quickly.
All right. I think that's a good place to end off. I do want to talk to you a little bit after the show. All right.
Okay.
All right. I'm going to stop recording. Any last words?
No, thank you very much. Great.
All right. Sounds good.